Hi, good morning, everybody. Great to see everyone back and the hall still full. Very pleased to be moderating this session this morning on Bridging Gaps for Climate Justice. It's a term that we've heard many times since the minister spoke this morning, so it'll be really interesting to really hear and dig into what it means, the term climate justice and what that means. And very pleased to be speaking to people who are working directly on the front lines of research, of community, of nature and youth, and of indigenous communities here in Malaysia, and to hear from them and their work and how financing is flowing to the very important things they do. So very briefly, climate justice refers to the unequal historical responsibility that countries and communities bear in relation to the climate crisis. It suggests that the countries, industries, businesses, and people that have become wealthy from emitting large amounts of greenhouse gases have a responsibility to help those affected by climate change, particularly the most vulnerable countries and communities, who often are the ones that have contributed the least to the crisis. If these are not addressed properly, this could result in profound economic and social tensions. It could even lead to delays in necessary changes. So what are some of the inequalities that we see? We know about structural inequalities. Even within the same country, we see the impacts of climate change may be felt unevenly due to structural inequalities based on race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status. Women, for example, are much more severely affected by climate change impacts because they have access to fewer resources to adapt and cope with abrupt changes. People with disabilities, for example, are at increased risk of adverse impacts of climate change, including threats to their health, food security, access to water, energy and sanitation, and livelihoods, particularly in developing countries like ours. Indigenous people, who protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, are facing increasing threats and risk to their lives, livelihoods, and traditional knowledge. We also see inequalities in socioeconomics. The impact of climate change and resources needed to address climate change impacts are distributed unequally around the world. Low-income countries and vulnerable populations within those countries are more susceptible to climate-induced loss and damage. Globally, we see that 10% of households with the highest per capita emissions contribute to 34 to 45% of global household greenhouse gas emissions, while the bottom 50% contribute less than 13 to 15%. If we scale that down to a Malaysian context, I wouldn't be surprised that we'll see similar numbers from cities to the more rural communities. We also know about intergenerational inequalities. Children and young people today have not contributed to the climate crisis in significant ways, but will bear the full force of climate change impacts as they advance through life. And this is people like Shao Loong and Banie. We were just talking about it in the holding room earlier. I remember when I started this work 15, 20 years ago, with what was called the Malaysian Youth Climate Justice Network, in what is today the Malaysian Youth Delegation. I remember being a token young person where I'd be put on a stage to say that I represent young people. And we also know that today there are youth committees that are being put together by ministers and ministerial committees. And I think there's a question of how much of those views are actually taken into account in policies and decision making. But conceptions very briefly of climate change and climate justice can be grouped along the lines of procedural justice. So this is more a process-oriented type of justice, which stresses fair, transparent, and inclusive decision-making, as well as distributive justice, which is focuses on outcomes and places the emphasis on who bears the cost of both climate change and the actions taken to address it. So a lot of the conversation around policy and finance, it's mostly focused around institutions of power. I think we heard from some of them today. We heard from some of them this morning. But while all people have inherent human rights to live and thrive, the lack of resources to limit and adjust to climate fallout is pushing a decent life and even survival beyond the reach of many. And that's a stark injustice. And it's compounded by the fact that countries and communities with most limited means are those who have contributed the least to climate change. And in many respects, climate finance, when it is sufficient and invested in the right ways, is a path to climate justice. So how can that happen? The UN Secretary General's Acceleration Agenda for 2023 outlines 6 critical actions for governments, businesses, and financial leaders. What are those 6? Number 1, make good of the 100 billion annual promise to developing countries for climate action. Number 2, double finance to help countries adapt to climate change. Number 3, reform the World Bank and other development banks to make them fit for purpose. Number 4, replenish the Green Climate Fund, which is the world's largest climate fund. Half is met for mitigation and the other half for adaptation. Number 5, operationalize the new Loss and Damage Fund. And number 6, protect all people from climate disasters with early warning systems by 2027. So I'm very excited to be speaking to some people at the forefront of this work today. If we could pass it on to, we've got Meenakshi Raman, who works with Third World Network and works directly with people at the grassroots. We've got Adrian Lasimbang, who works with indigenous communities here. We've got Fatin from WWF, who works engaging with young people and nature, and Shao Loong with the research community. Meena, could you say a little bit about your work?
Well, I wasn't expecting to be the first one, but happy to kick it off. Yeah, I come from Sahabat Alam Malaysia. Actually, I'm not as young as I look in that photo, but that was my young face. Certainly a young activist and have been here for the last, I'm not telling you how many years. But what's really critical is really the fact that many of us are rooted and working from the grassroots, because I think we sometimes in KL and the Klang Valley bubble, that's what I would like to refer to a lot of our conferences. I come from Penang, luckily, that, sometimes we are shielded from really the real happenings on the ground. And Banie and others, and we will talk more about that. But my own activism actually came with engaging with indigenous peoples from the Sarawak forest, defending their forests, fisher folk who are fighting for protection of mangroves and their marine resources, all very strongly connected actually to the livelihoods. And when they do actions, like when they promote agroecology, now it's a fancy name, but many of them were actually engaged with these kinds of agricultural practices which are not based on fossil fuels and chemicals. And you also have indigenous peoples with in the forefront of forest protection and fighting the timber companies and so on. So many of our inspiration came from working from these grassroots communities. And of course, as we engaged it's not enough only to be at the local or the national, have to be at the international as well. You mentioned the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest green climate dedicated fund for climate. Some of us actually worked with the developing country governments at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change with the Group of 77 in China to create that fund. And I don't like to brag, but I have to say I was one of the first developing country civil society representative on the board of the Green Climate Fund. So, no, you don't need to, I didn't say that as for deserving a clap, but only to say that when people talk about civil society and civil society engagement, we can engage at many levels. And I know a number of you are very passionate. I think the point is that how can we use our energies in whatever fields we are to be engaging in those advocacies. If we have come so far, whether it's the Green Climate Fund or even the Loss and Damage Fund, what you also mentioned, Khairun, very critical. That fund was only possible because of civil society campaigning both with the northern civil society groups, the global, we are also involved in what's called the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. And we have a platform, and it's around the world, a lot of global civil society voices from the south who are particularly representing the interests of those who are vulnerable and those who have been least responsible for climate change facing the impacts. So in that Loss and Damage Fund was able to be created because of a lot of political mobilizing in the United States. So we actually engage in political mobilization. So we are not just civil society who, we take money and we plant trees, but it's really about public advocacy and so on. So the last thing I want to say is that the climate finance is absolutely critical. We know, everybody is talking about it. It's not a Malaysian challenge alone. I just wanted to respond to the morning session. I just find that we are very, mitigation-centric. And as Shao Loong and others will say, it is important to do what we have to do, but Malaysia is only contributing less than 1% to the global emissions. And what you can see happening is that the impacts that we are facing is so tremendous We are not ready for the adaptation challenge. We are not ready really for the loss and damage. And you look at the heat waves. Where do we have to go? Kelantan, and not just Kelantan alone, because Topa is here, but you look at Mada, Penang is going through a water crisis. So we are facing the impacts. And I don't think we are talking enough about finance for adaptation, finance for loss and damage.
Thank you, Meena. Adrian, we worked briefly on the UK PAC program, which is the UK government's or Malaysia's largest international climate finance investments here in Malaysia. Would you like to say a little bit about RE2 and the work you do there?
Yeah, thank you, Khairun. And I think it's very important to also look at the grassroots and how the real situation is being really portrayed. Because again, one of the biggest problem we have in Malaysia is like how accurate is our data is. And for example, like in Sabah, we don't even know how many actually unelectrified communities are there. And you go to different agency, they have different figures and so on. So I think this exercise and also the research that was funded by the UK PAC is very important because it gives the actual reality on the ground where the needs are, and also what the options are to actually, for example, to electrify these communities. Because when you want to talk about transition, this community have transition to what? They have nothing. And this is something that we have to really look at and also take the opportunity to, from the right beginning, we already frame it so that it can be addressed to renewable energy options that is much more sustainable and so on. And those are the outcome of the Sabah RE study that we have done. But in the same time, we also managed to unearth a lot of these community efforts down there that is unknown to many of us, and how innovative communities have been trying to build their own self-help program to have access to electricity and water. And these are something that have been documented in the process, and these are something that my team in Tonibung have been working on for the last 25 years to develop all this community-based model that is already there. Solutions are there, but how come this sort of solution, community-based solutions, is not been given the opportunity to also be part of the options for us to move on? I think because lack of awareness about these sort of existing initiatives, but also the lack of trust from the government side to look at it's almost like they don't believe that the community actually can do it themselves. And when we even presented to the state KPLB, they said, "Do you sure that they managed to do micro hydro? How come we don't know about this?" And as I said, because you never go to the ground. And that's why. So, and then the exercise is actually really important to see that communities and civil society have already been working on sort of adaptation and solutions that is very much coming from the ground. And one of the things that really came out from that is the need for capacity building. And the problem with a lot of this is nobody wants to pay the soft cost, the software part. They want to see hardware, tangible. So a lot of the funding, especially even for corporate, they go CSR, they want to see building, they want to see pipe running, lights going up, but they don't even invest enough on making sure that there's enough training for the operators of the system so that it can be sustained. And a lot of this time, a lot of project failed because the lack of understanding of the dynamics of community on the grassroots level, and the lack of trust building that the community themselves can, if provided the opportunity, come up with a very robust structure of management through the ADAT system, through a lot of for me, because I come from an indigenous community, there's a lot of indigenous wisdom out there that can be used to actually to reduce the risk of this so-called investment. And the problem with I can say, just reflecting from all this, is like in normal economic model, we take everything from nature, but we don't give back to nature. In indigenous values, we take what we need and we give back when we have something to offer to to nature. And always like this, because if you don't respect nature, nature will come back with us with a hard whip on our back. So that's why we have to learn and then adopt a lot of our business way of doing things from the indigenous communities, because there's a lot of wisdom that managed to ensure the survival of these communities for millennia. And so I think it's high time that we should go back to some sort of models that is not normally mainstream, and look at some of this as a de-risking strategy for investment. So I think that is something that also came out from our study for the roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you, Banie. I think for context, the design of the financing mechanism, at least from an international climate finance perspective, was important. So one of the elements of the fund required demand from government. And the fact that you have been working on this for all these years, for 20 years, and it was the first time that there was a recognition from the government, from the Sabah government, or at least the energy sector, was really critical. So the demand of the structure of financing, I think, is something that we don't think about enough in terms of progressing how finance reaches the community. And what I was particularly impressed about, at least from the RE2, and for context, the audience context, 80% of unelectrified Malaysians are in Sabah. And the work that the Forever Sabah did, particularly in consortia with Tony Boong, which is an indigenous technology developer, as well as Pakos Trust, which had a map of where all these indigenous communities were particularly impressive. So it was we were very proud to have that on our portfolio of finance, but we'd love to hear more about that. But before that, perhaps we could hear from you, Fatin, and the work that you do with nature and young people.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Khairun. So first of all, I would like to kind of maybe point the elephant in the room that, I feel very humbled sitting here with all these veterans many years ahead of me. So I feel like I'm learning from them as much as you all in the audience as well. Okay, so back to my work. So I am from WWF, but unlike Mina and Banie here, I don't really work on the ground. So my role in WWF is within sustainable finance, and we work to advocate within the financial sector, and we have a two-pronged strategies, right? So the first strategy, which we have actually worked very closely, I saw Khairun, I think 2 years ago, was to how we can transform the financial system, right? So meaning, how do we advocate climate, biodiversity, and social human rights related issues within the system? How do you bring in the awareness? How do you bring in the technical skills to equate them, to prepare them for the change to come ahead? And another strategy is something that we are becoming more and more involved in, and something that has really humbled me, keep me grounded in my work in WWF, is that how do we try to channel or enable more financing towards conservation and nature projects? And with that, I've actually visited a lot of sites, conservation sites in WWF-Malaysia. And with that, I also got to know a lot of community-based enterprises whose livelihoods actually depend on the ecosystems that our conservation colleagues are trying to protect, right? So I won't go too much into it. I think there will be more questions coming in, so I'll just pause and here for now.
Thank you, Fatin. WWF has been really important catalyst in a lot of the policy and finance work in this part of the world. Perhaps a lot more in Singapore, but it's really heartening to see it growing in Malaysia as well. I think the work you do advising the Ministry of Finance, the central bank on some of the taxonomies, for example, really critical. But also I understand that the ecological fiscal transfer, WWF was very instrumental in that work, and we give credit where it's due. And we would love to hear a little bit more about how EFTs at least has progressed in country, what are the challenges, and perhaps what are the outcomes and what we expect to see. But perhaps, Shao Loong, we were just briefly discussing how long you've been in this sector. COP5 is a long time ago. So the work you do in data and policy, I think that filling in that gap and where financing could actually provide support for that work as we move towards a just energy transition.
Thanks, Khairun, for outing my age. Good morning, Assalamualaikum. So thinking back 22 years ago, when I was a younger, thinner, longer haired, and a bit angrier man, I was part of a group that drafted what became known as the Bali Principles of Climate Justice, which was one of the first written statements of setting out principles of climate justice. And we had an international drafting committee, people from North America, Latin America, Africa, Asia. We missed out on Antarctica for obvious reasons. And I took a fresh look at the draft this morning, and I think it still stands because it emphasizes fundamentally, it connects everything from the global science, climate change, down to the rights of communities, and the need for change to be just and inclusive. And reflecting back on what was also shared this morning from the policymakers and from the financial community, I think there still remains a lot of relevance for Malaysia's way forward. And there is a trilemma that Malaysians have to address with this. So we have this push for greater ambition in terms of our climate targets. We have this constraint in terms of limited financial resources. And then we have to reconcile that somehow with climate justice, or how we as Malaysians understand climate justice both domestically as well as internationally. Because I think, as Meena said, we have a very small contribution to global warming. It's a contribution nonetheless, but it's very, very small, right? Historically, we're responsible for about 0.37% of emissions, carbon emissions, right? The US takes the cake, that's 25%, all by itself. And there are just 5 countries which are responsible for 55% of emissions. So we are one of the minor league, but we of course have great potential. At the same time, I think a lot of the discussion has been about emissions and very little about climate adaptation, because we're going to be on the receiving end. How many of you here are from the financial industry? Can you raise your hands? Just makes sense. Okay, very weak hand. Didn't have enough coffee in the break. Okay, anybody here from insurance? Okay, all right. Well done to you guys. So you guys probably know that climate's a big insurance problem, right? So there's a report from the Swiss Re Institute recently. They try to model or project the damages that would happen to the ASEAN economy, Malaysia particularly, by I think around 2040, 2050. And they're looking at a hit of about 42% loss to GDP, right? And Malaysia is quite close to the ASEAN average. And those could be from physical impacts. It's not really transition risk that the financial institutions are worried about. It's physical impacts. And we're already feeling the physical impacts because we're right in the middle of a heat wave. I know it's very cold here, but it's really hot outside. And people are actually coming in with medical conditions as a result. The other climate impact that we're most familiar with is floods. But there's one impact that even if we get our emissions down to net zero, everybody else does the right thing, gets down to net zero, and we stabilize the world at 1.5 degrees average warming, there's one impact that's going to be locked in for 1,000 years, at least, and that's sea level rise. We don't have a plan for sea level rise. Malaysia is primarily a coastal country. 70% of our population live in coastal areas. Some of us also live on islands. What is going to happen? And now here's the climate justice problem. If we don't have enough climate finance to cover our adaptation needs, somebody, most likely in Putrajaya, is going to sit down at the end of the day with some form, hopefully with a cost-benefit analysis, or maybe they'll just make a quick decision by looking at the map. Who is going to have an intervention to keep them afloat, and who is going to sink? Which community is going to be, or part of Malaysia, is going to be considered not financially viable for an intervention on climate adaptation? I hope it doesn't happen, but I fear that will be a decision taken because we're a developing country. We may be on the cusp of high income, but basically we're just getting our toes through the door, right? We're not comfortably wealthy in the way some other countries are. We still have a lot of poverty and inequality that we have to bridge. And we have a great inequality even at the local government level, right? MBPJ, Petaling Jaya Council, is one of the richest councils in the world, right? But that's because the population that it services is very wealthy, right? Can you say the same for, the local council in Kota Baru or in parts of Sabah? They will not have the same resources to make interventions, right? And adaptation interventions need to be made at the local level. They need to be made in consultation with local communities. If someone decides in Putrajaya, I'm not knocking Putrajaya just for the sake of it, but you can't make effective adaptation decisions just in Putrajaya for the rest of the country, right? Because it has to be devolved. And we've had some discussion with the German government on their experience as well. Korean government even, they actually have a law that mandates that adaptation is the responsibility of local government. We're not there yet. We've got some draft Climate Change Act coming, but it doesn't discuss any of this stuff as far as I know. It's all focused on mitigation. But if you do all the mitigation in Malaysia, which is only responsible for 0.37%, we have to wait around for the US, the EU, Russia, China, Japan, Britain, and the other big emitters to get their act together and really cut emissions dramatically for the climate to stabilize at 1.5 degrees centigrade. We can do our bit to get net zero. We can be as ambitious as you want, but the outcome of climate change is actually almost entirely externally dependent, right? The technical word that economists like to use is exogenous, right? But it's down to us to do what we can to mitigate the physical impacts that happen to us. And those physical impacts, I think we can learn a lot actually from our neighbors in the Philippines or even Bangladesh about physical impacts, because they have upgraded a lot. Bangladesh used to be vulnerable to natural disasters, typhoons and all that all the time. Then they put in an early warning system, and now they're much less vulnerable. The Philippines, their climate law is actually about institutional chain of command and responsibility for climate adaptation. Who reports to who? We don't have any of that discussion happening right now in Malaysia. We're very much focused on emissions. That's fine, that's well and good. We've made commitments on that, we need to make good on that. At the same time, our government has a responsibility to the rakyat, with citizens, to protect them. And protection, national security, also involves climate security. And climate security ultimately involves dialogue, inclusion, debate. So part of the concept of justice is also procedural justice. Who gets access to discussions? And I was mentioning earlier, sometimes a policy consultation is called for in Putrajaya with 2 days' notice. I can get there because I live in KL. It's easy, right? I can grab there. Bani in Sabah, he's got a hustle over here. And then people who live in coastal communities, maritime communities, often don't show up. They're not present in the room because they don't have the sufficient notice and sufficient resources to get there to make their case heard. And one of the sad facts of climate impacts is going to be that between 99% to 100% of coral reefs are going to be wiped out at 1.5 degrees centigrade. Like the science says either 99 or 100. It's bad either way. And coral reefs are crucial for fishing communities. Right? So what is going to happen to our fishing communities? Fish protein is a major part of our diet. It's a major part of the diet for the poor, right? Because you can just go out and get it. It's not the same as catching chickens. So these are issues of socioeconomic justice that strike us when we're dealing with climate adaptation, because we have to understand success in the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees actually means a lot of impacts, a lot of harsh, terrible impacts the brunt of which will be borne by the poorest in society, those who are already denied justice and inclusion. So in order to reduce the level of marginalization, we actually have to work harder to change our society, to be more inclusive, and also mobilize the financial resources, bringing it back to climate finance, right, that get there. I'll stop now. Put it back.
Thank you, Shao Loong. I think aside from the tokenism and the risk of tokenism and representation is something worth discussing, but also the idea around how much information do we actually have to be able to channel financing where it's needed. So kind of focusing it back, we have 25 minutes that includes the Q&A. So I think I'm going to bundle the questions that we discussed that we will speak about to maybe speak briefly, maybe 5 minutes each at max, to talk about how you are currently financing the work you do. I remember at COP14, a lot of the work we were doing was around getting access to even the room. In fact, COP14, I remember submitting a consultative paper together with other young people around the world for us to be in the room, to be part of that discussion as an observer community. And in COP15 was the first time that young people were actually represented. So we've actually come some way. And could you say a little bit about how civil society and other groups, Meena, in doing that work, perhaps also speaking about where you're currently getting that financing, how you're using that financing, the gaps in that financing, and what are the solutions that we're looking at in terms of unlocking this financing for the work that you do?
Maybe I'll be a bad person and not respond to your question about our own financing. I think there is a will, there is a way. Where the kinds of money you're talking about, civil society and how we are raising money. One thing, this country is not very philanthropic, by the way. Very difficult to get money. And so climate, if you want to build a temple, there's money. You want to go to an orphanage, there's money. For Cancer Foundation, even you might have money, but not for civil society. So it doesn't matter, we will continue to do what we have to do. But I think the point I want to raise is actually the issue of financing for the kind of community work that happens on the ground in the grassroots, and the challenge that is connecting to biodiversity and ecosystems. There's a big, whether it's a market-based approach or whether it should be a collaborative approach. There's two different clashing paradigms. And I'm going to be very provocative here. Now, in relation to the one financing model that's been really good and effective is the UNDP Small Grants Program. Many of us have had experience with that. If some of the work that many of us have done is through that, which actually, because we actually sit at the National Steering Committee level, civil society represented, government represented, and then you really have the voice of communities, and you're able to directly make sure that the money goes to where it needs to go. So there is a livelihood issue with communities, they are participating, it's meaningful, and they drive it. It's really community owned. Now that's a very good model. And that's the kind of grant-based model. They don't ask for co-financing, they talk about in-kind financing. So that's a very good model. Now that's the kind of model that we should upscale and do a much, much better job of, because there's not enough money there, it dries up. And communities are funded for about 18 months and then there's no more money. Now that's not sustainability. And then you are asked, how are you going to raise your own money? Then we are all stuck. So I think that's a good model, and we need to do more, and we can do more with more financing to the Green Climate Fund, to the Adaptation Fund, and we are fighting for a loss and damage window for communities there. Because governments are not the only way you channel money. You have to have processes which channel money directly, but that the front line of the people who are actually there were able to deliver. So these are good lessons to learn. Now the alternative which is happening right now, carbon markets. Right? Now, why do the private sector come? You have, and this is where I'm going to be provocative, you have timber companies in Sarawak who have been deforesting and with whom indigenous peoples have been fighting, and today they have transformed themselves into subsidiaries to have what's called engaging in carbon credits. So now they're going to the community and telling the community, we're going to do reforestation, you can help us, and this is how you can participate. So you have a Jekyll and a Hyde here. Suddenly you've become, Mr. Jekyll has become Mr. Hyde. And they are coming down to the community, and when the community says, what is this all about? We don't know what's carbon. Anybody knows what's carbon? Do you know how CO2 is measured? Have you seen a product called a carbon credit? Now I'm asking questions like this because nobody can verify. The carbon market is the biggest fraud that is has been unleashed. I told you I was going to be provocative. Yeah? It's speculative, it's not tangible, and we are selling it. And why are the corporations very excited? Because net zero. I offset, I fly and then I plant a tree. I've done. I am a good citizen. Right? I can continue to emit and I plant a tree and that CO2 is going to be sucked up. No, come off it. Are we scientists or what? Yeah. So it's not a laughing matter. It's damn serious. And why is the private sector interested? Because scope 1, scope 2, ESG, this, that, and the other. So this is where it's all about the offsetting. And so when we asked this company who approached Indigenous peoples, said, can you show us what is the document that you asked them to sign? He said, no, not transparent. What is this? What is free prior informed consent? How are communities going to be taking part? One day you destroyed their land rights, and the next day you're coming in asking them to be help you save the forest. So, and then of course we are really worried about governance. A lot of the state governments are saying, I think the ecological fiscal transfer is the way to go. Grant-based, raise money, make sure that it's a lot more. But the minute you have all these foreign companies coming in and all kinds of shell companies and scams which are coming and selling, and it's the new goal, I think we are really in fantasy island. And so there's a lot of stuff out there. We are talking about the Vera and this and that and the gold standard. I don't think it's a gold standard. It's a lot of problems. So we do need to have, that's not climate financing. It's not going to get money to where it needs to go. So we need to have proper governance. We need grant-based finance, a lot more financing in terms of grants for adaptation and loss and damage.
Thank you, Meena. I'd love to... Thanks. I'd love to hear a little bit about Kuamut, but also, you've got the Kuamut that's been celebrated and being sold on the BCX today. But we also hear about the NCA, which is the other side of the story. I think we'll maybe save that for actually a carbon discussion. But I wonder if we should refocus the conversation to financing indigenous technology and indigenous solutions, how those challenges have looked like for you over the last 20 years. What looks hopeful as well, and why do these solutions fit Malaysia specifically?
Thank you. Before I go to that sort of more different kind of discussion, I think I just want to just echo what Meena has presented just now with regards to the small grants and how it actually very important for civil society and communities as a whole. Because for me, a lot of the over 40 different community mini-grid systems that we built in Sabah Sarawak is actually funded through this small grants program. And even though $50,000 for some is peanuts, but this actually means a lot, because if you look at the other benefits from it, from watershed conservation into productive end use of energy and so on, it adds the value to it. And that's why I think the direct financing to particularly for indigenous communities is very important. And grants based is actually something that really can catalyze also innovation, because you're not forced to really think about in a business sense, because you are really looking at the return is back to nature. It's not back to the pockets of someone who give you the money. And this is something that we should always consider. And for many indigenous communities, it has been a big challenge, because for us, many I call it CBOs, community-based organization, doesn't have the credentials to have access to larger grants. I know in Malaysia we have Yayasan Hasanah with all those grants, which is very good. But unfortunately, we have to also realize the condition and also the situation of many community-based organizations. You don't have those credentials of 5-year or 3-year, accounting and so on, because we don't even afford to pay someone to do accounts, and even the capacity to do that. Of course, there is a challenge on that, bridging that capacity gap. So I think the grant should also look towards capacity building that bundles together with grants to do actual projects. And that is how we can catalyze a lot of this, adaptation and community-based solution that is already been developed in Malaysia. So in my work now at REP, I'm actually already extending it to a lot of other countries now, that the community-based solutions that we have developed through the community-based renewable energy mini-grids is already extending to Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Nepal, and they learn a lot. I'm very fortunate because we are forced to look at different financing in Malaysia because upper middle income country. So we don't have this ODA. So that's why we come up with a very innovative ways to actually look at how it can be financed. And one way is actually bundle it up together with social entrepreneurship, so that a social entrepreneur can take on the business model and do about the sustainability of the systems and so on. But in the same time, there is also large funding available internationally, but it doesn't trickle down to the community because it goes through like big organizations. So what we have done in making sure indigenous communities also have this is to come up with what they call a solidarity fund. So we have just launched last year in Dubai the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Fund of Asia. We call it IPAS. So we're trying to consolidate the different countries working together so that we can have a pool of funds that can be decided by indigenous organizations themselves, and also help those organizations to have sort of the capacity in order to manage those funds. I know it's not easy to manage funds and reports, but these are something that needs to be invested on. So the finance should not just go towards the project, but also the capacity building of the community. And last but not least, of course, we are trying to see the other options of how nature-based solutions are still there. And of course, indigenous people have always been subject to that. So I'm not sure whether I should comment about this, but I still see that there is potential for community to participate in this. But if it's not recognized through indigenous peoples as rights holder, then it's not really a good thing, because if we are indigenous people, for example, when it comes to talk about carbon market, carbon solution and so on, we are not just stakeholders, we are rights holders. We are rights holders to our forest. So it has to be considered to be seen at that perspective, and to make sure that they also have equity in terms of the share of the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Banie. I'm really conscious of time. We have 10 minutes, so perhaps, Shao Loong, I will save you for the Q&A. But Fatin, I wonder if you could say, we've got a $700 billion gap at the moment for financing nature. Could you say a little bit, and engaging a little bit with what Banie has said earlier about nature-based solutions, and whether or not we have visibility of the financing gap here in Malaysia, and how we are planning to close that gap?
Okay, sure. So just for clarification, when I mention nature-based solutions, I don't mean carbon credits, just to clarify. So nature-based solutions, not one-to-one equal to conservation, are activities that protect, restore, or sustainably manage ecosystems, be it natural or modified. It has to solve societal challenges, and it has to bring biodiversity net gain, right? So there are a few I would say criteria to what can constitute a nature-based solutions. And in WWF-Malaysia, we try to place or put narrative on our projects very strategically so that it can attract philanthropic funding, and we try to move towards private funding as well, and I will get into that. So one of the ways that one of our program in Sabah has done is that we try to package it on the landscape. So it's not just funding one activity or one specific program, but we package it 3-in-1. So basically, when you finance our specific project, you're basically financing protection, you're financing restoration, and you're financing sustainable production, which is palm oil in Sabah. So we package it in such a way that, because we know corporates more and more, they will have very strategic needs or very strategic wants to invest in projects which will have strategic importance to them. And what this means is that because corporates, with the upcoming of TNFD, Task Force for Financial Related Disclosures, they are required to kind of assess their own operational nature risk. They are required to assess their own direct impacts as well as indirect impact, their scope 3, which is within their supply chain. And the next strategy for us is to position our project in such a way that when you invest in our project, you are actually investing for resilience to your own business. So we want to make it a win-win situation, right? So you invest in our project, we are actually building resilience for the community, because nature-based solution is just a natural solution for climate adaptation. It's cheap, it's affordable, it's a natural defense. You have drought incoming, you don't cut down trees, because tree keeps water and water keeps our kind of climate cool, and it provides water during drought season, right? You are worried about coastal erosion, you don't cut down mangroves, you restore it. So we do have a specific kind of strategic need for it, but we want to kind of narrate our project in such a way that we make it a win for potential donors, be it philanthropic or private funders as well. And moving into what Banie said about CBO, community-based organizations. So we talk about protect, we talk about restoration, and we know that there are very limited funding options for this. So there are upcoming market-based instruments, I would say. Payment for ecosystem services is one of them. And in fact, we actually attempted to do that in one of the states in Peninsular Malaysia. We did a whole study on a forest complex in one of the states. But the barrier remains is there's no political willingness to fund for it, because there will always be a trade-off between, okay, I protect forests, but what would be that, in terms of loss of revenue, in terms of timber for me. So there's always that, I would say, barrier or issue, which is why in WWF, we try to be very creative in terms of how we narrate our project and what is it a win for you. So when we go into community-based enterprises, we try to support community-based enterprises who livelihoods are dependent on ecosystem. And by growing these enterprises, they are actually helping to sustainably manage these ecosystems. And this is where we want private financing to come in. First, we'll come in with grant. We want to kind of support them. We try to support them, with technical assistance to grow them to a stage where they are investment ready, so that private financing can come in. I'll stop here. I think Khairun wants to say.
Thank you. It's a bit of a challenge to moderate four speakers relative to the earlier session with 3. So I think we're going to open up questions on the floor. And if anyone who has questions can make their way to the mics that are along the floor, that would be great. And while we wait for that, I'm going to take an opportunity to ask Shao Loong a question. So some of the work we do at Nusanterra is attempting to put a price on nature. So we've done this piece of work in Perak, specifically to put a price on the ecosystem services in hopes that will help decision makers, or at least asset managers of nature, to be able to make better decisions. Do you have thoughts around, at least from the financing point of view, on whether or not this is helpful to channel financing towards where we need it to go?
Okay, this is a great question. Pricing comes up a lot in terms of environmental and climate issues. I would say my comments now on talking about pricing nature, particularly in terms of payment for ecosystem services, I would distinguish them from commenting about carbon pricing, right, on an international basis. I don't want to get into theory, but it's a very important area, because right now there's almost next to zero value assigned to nature. The only value of a forest primarily in the law is in terms of its conversion to timber as cess, right? That is a legacy of British scientific forestry management, where basically nature is heavily discounted, and primarily forests are mainly conserved for production, right? You don't consider whether they tap into groundwater, they conserve hill slope integrity, all this kind of stuff. Now the government, and Dr. Bai is here obviously as former Minister for the Economic Planning Unit, which is now Kementerian Economy. Kementerian Economy, EPU, has been the steward of payment for ecosystem services for I think almost 20 years now. And it's been studied and studied, and I think there was a conference recently amongst the scholars in Malaysia who work on this stuff, but kind of like 95% there in terms of measuring every single ecosystem. I think there's a desire to hit 100% of the studies before any kind of policy is considered. That will maybe still take a while. I remember trying to have a conversation with the former Auditor General, actually, about this, because when I used to work in state government in Selangor, the state declared a policy of a moratorium on logging for 25 or 30 years, right? Because Selangor only had 30% forest left, already pretty rich. We didn't need to rely on logging revenue like some other states did, so we declared a moratorium on logging. Then we got scolded by the Auditor General for not logging, not maximizing our logging revenue. So there's a perverse incentive in the existing accounting system of government that would reprimand states for not logging, right? And that's precisely also because we don't have institutionalized sense of payment for ecosystem services, or that ecosystem services actually have value to them, right? And I think that's very important to recognize.
Great, thanks, Shao Loong. And I'm going to put a bit of a plug. We're working on something called the Biodiversity Bank, which what we hope will hold these values of these ecosystem services. And we'd be really keen to learn about whether or not we have that data and how much of that data gap that we actually have. Where will this data database sit? Who should have access to it? I think that this could essentially pave way for something like a Biodiversity Act, perhaps, to give rules as to if development was happening at a large scale or at whatever scale, they need to consider a biodiversity assessment. What are the baselines? How much would projects like that contribute to biodiversity loss, and whether or not developers should pay for a net gain, perhaps, which in some parts of the world is required. Great. We've got questions. I think we'll take all of them at the same time and then have the speakers answer them. Perhaps this jet over here. If you could start with your name and where you're from before you proceed your question. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum and hi, good morning. I'm Shamsul from IIUM, International Islamic University, Malaysia. A simple question really, because Mr. Shao Loong has been fighting really since COP5 and now it's COP28. It's a long journey. And I wanted to ask, when COP28 is pushing for net zero and this climate strategy, and Shao Loong even said for a just strategy for national climate strategy, how is it relevant to our economy as a whole, to the ground actually? Because at the end of the day, like Meenakshi said just now, it is what matters for us now is the food that we put on the table every day. How do we put the care for the people in Malaysia to say, oh yes, there is great importance of climate finance, and not only to address the lack of salary of ourselves in our daily lives actually. And number two is the goals. Are the goals from COP28, from COP5, from COP1 still relevant to Malaysia's economy? And is NETA and NIMP is the most adaptable and the most suitable for every range of society? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe this gentleman on the left.
Yes. Okay. So there's been discussion about, sorry, my name is Shamil. I'm an A-level student from College Tunku Jaafar. And there's been a discussion on grant-based finance, right? But I think there's a big problem about red tape, such as Adrian said about keeping up with the financials and keeping up with the accountings, right? So should there be more deregulation happening in the government so these communities could get better, for these communities to get their finance? And towards a certain extent, right, on the question of innovation, I think the innovation in our country is slow paced because in terms of like energy, it's being controlled or monopolized by big companies such as Petronas. So should deregulation also happen in that sector?
Thank you. I think we've got a lady on the left and then the gentleman on the middle.
Hello. Hi, I'm Putri Majid. I'm from Bukit Raja Klang, a half-submerged city. And we have witnessed an indelible flood incident a few years back, although it's not comparable to certain areas like Hulu Langat. And being a climate advocate myself, it's very obvious how climate action is very centralized, especially in adaptation measures, where responsibilities of the measures have been continuously passed from one party to another, from the local government to JPALM. And even after attending town hall that was supposed to prepare us for flood disasters, we were lectured on how we should opt for community-based adaptation. Now, there are many challenges and conditionalities in assessing funding. And since the responsibility now has been shifted to the communities that are mostly socio-economically marginalized and are comprised of mostly warga emas, my question is, how do communities on the ground navigate this adaptation responsibility with very little resources? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question for the gent.
Thank you very much for interesting discussion. I am Victor from New City, Malaya. I would like to ask, basically, this is a finance summit, correct? So we have, and most of the companies are focusing on ROI, which is return on investment. But why can't we just focus on ROV, which is value, instead of investment? Value in the context of value to the environment, value to the health, because we understand from the it was basically a catastrophe during the COVID-19, and that was basically due to the act of our human, and that is what is important. So maybe you all can share, when can we move from return on investment to return on value? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to take 4 minutes, and I'm going to get each of you to answer one of those questions. So relevance for Malaysia in terms of climate policy, from evolution of the climate finance journey. We've seen Meena, if you don't mind taking that. Grants-based finance, perhaps the question on that, Banie, if you don't mind. The question about climate risk, Fatin, if you don't mind taking that one. And Shao Loong on the ROV. I think 1 minute each, please. I'm going to tap my mic when your 1 minute is up. Over to you.
I'm supposed to answer. Maybe that question about the net zero and the first question about, from the COP. Actually, net zero, in the Paris Agreement, net zero is a global aspiration. It's not a country by country aspiration. It became a country by country aspiration because of the Glasgow climate. The British, when they organized that, it became net zero for everyone. Actually, it doesn't make sense at all. And so that's why there was this problem, because from a global to a national, as we had said, there is an issue about how equity and the sharing of the remaining carbon budget, how do you use it in a fair way and so on. So I think, I'm not sure where the question was going, but in terms of financing, I think the only thing that I want to say for those of us who are focusing on the Conference of Parties is Baku is absolutely critical in Azerbaijan. And so we are fighting for the new collective quantified goal on finance. So there is a civil society campaign which has been launched, and we have called it, at least paid a down payment of $5 trillion a year. If we can have money for wars, you can have money for fossil fuel subsidies, you have money, it's a political will that needs to be delivered. I'm not sure whether I'm answering any question, but I just wanted to say that there's a lot that we have to do.
Thank you, Meena. Grants-based finance, if Banie, go.
Yeah, energy sector. I think one of the things that really also constrain innovation and also adaptation of renewable energy is because predominantly energy is dominated by few, basically Petronas, TNB, and so on. Because regulatory wise, retail of energy is only through TNB and or the state utility. So this is actually a very big issue, because if you want to electrify rural communities, you have to come up with very different way of doing it. You cannot go continuously do grid extension, and the only way you can do it is through mini grid systems, decentralized, and it can only happen if you liberalize the energy sector and allow private and community based also to join in and provide those solution for the community, and that is why we can actually enhance and actually catalyze the adaptation of renewable technologies, and eventually one day it will come back again. Thank you.
Well done, Banie, for 1 minute. Fatin, climate risk, the question on climate risk, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I would like to say I sympathize because I'm from Terengganu, so I've experienced flood firsthand, right? So with climate risk adaptation, how do we help community-based entity? How do we help community to actually tackle flood risk, for example, adaptation. So by right, it should be the local district or the local government responsibility. But in absence of that, I think there's always, I mean, coming from the point of view of as an NGO, there's always funding opportunities. So what the best thing you could do is to approach any civil societies that's kind of operating or maybe covering those areas and see what kind of angle you can go from there. But I think that's all for me.
Thank you, Fatin. I think they've switched off my mic. But over to you, Shao Loong, for the last question on ROV.
Okay, I'll give you a 3-in-1. Okay, rate of return. The issue is that we're committed to capitalism, so rates of return matter. The rate of return for renewable energy projects is about 5%. The rate of return for fossil fuel projects ranges from 12 to 15%. If you're in an institution that has a mandate to generate returns on investment, where will you go? Unless there's a policy intervention. That's why industrial policy matters, and this goes to question 1, question 2. Industrial policy can shape outcomes. They can also create rewarding, high-wage, green jobs. Not a lot, but some, that also generate benefits at the community level. In order to generate returns to scale in industrial policy, you do need big companies to maximize innovation. Small companies will struggle to generate the innovation returns that can cascade into the rest of the economy. They're going to be a longer answer, but that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. Please give a round of applause to my panelists, please. Thank you.